welcome back to the homestead. I'm Carrie and this is our youngest, Abigail. She's joining me today. We'll see how long she lasts for this video. So recently someone commented about the echinacea that we have in our garden and was curious about native plants. So I thought it'd be fun to do a whole video highlighting the native plants that we have in our kitchen garden to hopefully give any of you who live in a similar climate or maybe even live in Missouri some ideas for your garden. And real quick, the two books that I use mostly for identification for these native plants are the Missouri Gardener's Guide by Mike Miller and the Tried and True Missouri Native Plants for Your Yard book put out by the Missouri Department of Conservation. I got this one actually from the Nature Center in Springfield. If you are in the area and you've never been to the Nature Center in Springfield, I highly recommend it. It's a wonderful place. It's free. There's hiking trails that are just beautiful. It's a really great place to learn, and they have a lot of good resources there. So what's the point of having native plants in your garden? Well, I'm actually going to read from this book here a quote that says it really well. The hardy plants showcased in this publication are designed for Missouri's frigid winters, sweltering summers, less than desirable soils, and degrees of moisture that range from drought to flood. So simply put, native plants are those that are tried and true for your area, and especially if you're new to gardening, they're a great place to start because they are adapted to your climate, to your soil, and to your weather, and should perform really well for you. And almost all of these native plants bring in beneficial bugs to the garden. Many of these plants have medicinal properties, so I'll try and put those up on the screen as we go through the list. Sometimes it's best to stick to the wild variety of a particular plant when it comes to natives, but sometimes you can do really well taking a native variety and getting a cultivated version of that variety, and it can do well. So I'm going to specify as I go through this list those plants that you want to really stick with the wild variety and not venture out into the cultivated varieties, and those where you could venture out into the cultivated varieties and get lots of different colors and varieties for your garden. So today I'm going to walk through the different plants that we have based on when they bloom, their bloom time. So I'll start with the spring blooming ones, then move on to summer and end with fall. You ready? Here we go. There's a lot of plants. So for spring, we've got actually a redbud tree right above me. It was here when we moved onto the property and we just left it because it's absolutely beautiful with the pink blooms in the spring, and it provides nice shade in this part of the garden. It just is a lovely tree and it works well for us in our garden. Some of you may not have space for a medium-sized tree in your garden, but if you do, the redbud is awesome. Next up we have serviceberry. Blueberries tend to not do so well in our soil, so I looked into some alternatives and serviceberry was what I found. They're a small tree. I probably could prune them to be actually a bush instead of a tree, and they have a berry that's delicious, quite similar to blueberries if you can get them before the birds do. And the birds love them as well, so you have to be on top of it if you want to gather those berries. The next one is dogwood. We've got just tons of wild dogwoods all around us, but in the garden space we've got some smaller bush dogwoods. It's actually red twig dogwood, and so they've got lovely blooms in the spring, and then in the fall and winter you've got some interest there with the red branches. So that's a really fun one. If you've got a small garden, it's one that you can kind of prune and keep smaller, and actually pruning it allows for more of that red color to come out. Dogwood is one of those varieties that you don't have to just have the wild versions. There's lots of cultivated varieties that you can incorporate into the garden that can do really well. Next up is viburnum. This is another variety that you could probably get just about any of the cultivated varieties. However, I did a little research on this one and found that Steady Eddie is supposed to be a good performer for the Missouri area. The wild viburnum, of course, would do really well. It's a fun bush plant that doesn't get too big if you prune it, and it's got beautiful white spring blooms. Our little Steady Eddie right now is actually being choked out by some daisies that we're supposed to only get about 1.5 feet tall, and as with many things here in Missouri, if it says they'll only get 1 foot tall, you can guarantee they're going to get at least 2 feet tall. It's kind of how it is here in Missouri, and so I'm often looking for dwarf varieties. So I'm going to have to dig out that Steady Eddie viburnum and rehome it. because those daisies have really taken over, and I love the daisies. So I'm probably going to actually move the whole clump of daisies into the center of the bed and move that steady eddy that was in the center of the bed somewhere else where it can get some more sun. I lost my little buddy. She made it through about 10% of the list. Alright, next up for the spring blooms is Jacob's Ladder. I have a variety that has white blooms. The wild variety has typically more of a light purpley blue bloom on it. I found with this it needs shade and it's very slow to mature, at least in my experience so far. We've had this plant for a couple of years now and it still hasn't bloomed. So I'm still waiting on those blooms and hoping that it's going to be a keeper. Next up is squawweed. It's got a lovely little leaf pattern that kind of acts as a ground cover, but then in the spring it shoots up these purple stems with beautiful little yellow flowers. And so that's a fun one. I do not know if it's invasive because where I actually moved it, I've got another invasive plant with it. So it may or may not be invasive depending on how you plant it. Next up is wild geraniums. I actually don't have any of the wild variety in my garden, but this is one where any variety seems to do well. I love this one because it's got a really unique leaf structure that just gives that extra interest even when it's not blooming. So wild geraniums or any variety of geranium seems to do well here in Missouri. Next is wild sweet William. This is one that we have transplanted from the woods into our garden and I absolutely love it. It's pretty lavender blooms in the spring and they last for a pretty long time and they are not invasive at all. I kind of wish they were invasive. They stay right where you put them and are just so dependable every spring giving those beautiful blooms. I'm not sure if cultivated varieties of this one work well or not. We have a white sweet William that's more of a biennial that we use in the garden and I love it, but I don't. It's got incredible white blooms in the spring, but it doesn't handle our heavy spring rains very well. It tends to just flop to the ground when it rains heavy in the spring. So that's one you have to be careful of as far as getting cultivated varieties, but the wild sweet William is wonderful. Next is columbine. Columbine is so fun. It comes in so many different colors, and this is another one where pretty much any variety has worked well for us. My favorite is the pink petticoat variety. It's pink and white. It's really beautiful and it's reliable, comes back every year. It does self-seed, but in a manageable way. And I actually like that it self-seeds because I can kind of spread it around the garden and it doesn't take over. So that's one you can really have a lot of fun with. Choose your favorite color and it'll just keep coming back every year. Next up is foxglove beard tongue, and this is actually a penstemon. Don't confuse it with the common foxglove. This is a wild plant. It does tend to flop when it rains because it gets really tall, so you might want to put it in an area where it can kind of be supported by some other plants or along a fence line or something to give it a little bit of structure. I had to actually tie mine up this year because the blooms were so beautiful. I didn't want to cut it down after it flopped, so I just kind of tied it all up together in a group. Next is golden Alexanders. I got a plant a couple years ago and actually it got buried by our mountain mint, so I had to transplant it this year. So I haven't seen any blooms on it yet, but it's a beautiful plant and it gives nice yellow flowers. So I'm looking forward to actually seeing those flowers next spring. It does like a bit of shade, but you don't want it to be completely covered, so it's full shade. It needs a little sun as well. The next plant is Amsonia, also known as Shining Blazing Star. And this is one that you could probably get just about any variety. The variety I have is called Storm Cloud, so it's not the actual wild variety. It's a cultivated variety, but it's doing really well. It can handle some part shade. Beautiful true blue blooms in the spring. It's got a nice leaf structure after the blooms are gone that pair well with a variety of different foliages. The next spring bloom is called Southern Blue Flag. It's a purple iris cross of some sort, and actually we found ours just along our creek side and transplanted them into our garden, and we've been dividing them out ever since. So now we've got them under all 4 of our apple trees in the kitchen garden here, And so far they've been really reliable. They've bloomed almost every year for us in pretty much full shade. I think they like some sun as well, but the full shade they're working. Alright, so the last one for spring blooms is Missouri Primrose. I don't actually have the wild variety. It's a yellow bloom. I have a variety called Twilight, and this is one where I would say be really careful, because the Twilight one that I have, though it's absolutely beautiful, it is super invasive. So if you like primrose and you don't mind the yellow color, I'd go with the wild varieties. If you want a different color, there are some varieties that are not invasive, but the Twilight is very invasive. I'm still up in the air whether I'm going to keep it in the garden or not. I've got it in a lot of places, so it's going to be hard to get rid of if I choose to kick that out of the garden. We'll see. So next we'll move on to summer. The first up is called Little Blue Stem. It's actually a grass. I don't have a lot of grasses in the garden yet because often grasses take a lot of space. Although I have a fairly large garden, it's not huge. So Little Blue Stem is nice because it stays little, just like its name says. And it's got beautiful blue and purple colors in the grasses through the summer and into the fall. Next is aromatic aster. Asters, I believe, are one of those that you can probably get some of the cultivated varieties. You just want to be careful that you don't get something that's invasive. There's a lot of wild aster out there that's pretty aggressive, so be careful which variety you get. So far the aromatic aster, it has self-seeded in the garden, but not uncontrollably. It's just a bounty of color through the summer and into the fall. It's one that's new to the garden that I'm really glad I added. Next is Black-Eyed Susan. This is one that self-seeds amazingly well, and so it can be invasive. There actually may be some cultivated varieties that are not as invasive. I haven't tried them. So far we've only had the wild Black-Eyed Susan in our garden that just self-seeded. And where I've got it in the garden right now, it's actually trying to take over my bush beans, so I had to really chop it back. But an unexpected blessing of it this year is that it seems to be keeping the bugs off of our cucumbers and squash that are planted on the trellis right behind it. So that's something to note. Some of these native plants may end up having potential for bug deterrent on some of your food crops. I'm going to test that one, see if Black-Eyed Susans potentially could be just what we need for our cucumbers, because often our cucumber plants get wiped out by bugs here in Missouri. Next one is called Purple Poppy Mallow. It's also a new one to the garden. We just added it last year and I'm super glad we did. It's a low growing ground cover plant with unique foliage and this beautiful poppy that comes up in the sunshine, so full sun's good for it. Right now I've got it planted with another native, Creeping Jenny. I don't have the wild yellow variety of Creeping Jenny, but we've got just a regular green Creeping Jenny, and it pairs really well with Purple Poppy Mallow. Right below are amazing daylilies called Purely that are in bloom right now. The next summer bloom is called Garden Phlox. And I believe this is another variety where you could get the wild variety, which is a pink color, or you could get some of the other cultivated varieties like I've got in my garden. Right now we have ultraviolet one. It really surprised me because I noticed it blooming for the first time yesterday and it was this bright magenta color. And then first thing this morning when I went out to film it, it was this deep dark purple. Really interesting. I don't think it did that last year, so I'm not sure what's going on with that. Maybe something to do with the soil pH. But Garden Phlox is a great one. We also have David. In our white garden, it's just about to bloom into some beautiful white flowers. So if you don't have garden phlox in the garden, that's one you can have a lot of fun with. Next up is purple coneflower, otherwise known as echinacea. This is another one where pretty much any variety will do great here in Missouri. I think I've got about 5 different varieties in the garden right now. If you let it self-seed, the new seeded plants will eventually go back to the wild variety. So if you want to keep a pure cultivated variety, you have to make sure you keep that plant healthy and don't let some of the seeded plants take over. It of course loves full sun, but it will take a little shade as well. I think my favorite variety in the garden right now for echinacea is called White Perfection. It's a really short plant and it's actually staying truly short even here in Missouri, and I'm just really loving that one. Milkweed is another variety where you probably pretty much get any of the cultivated varieties or some of the wild varieties. Right now I have one that's I think called rose milkweed, and I just prefer it to the bright orange color. So it's got a nice rose color. It's pretty much done blooming now, so it's more of a late spring, early summer bloomer, but it pairs well with things like echinacea and liatris. Of course, it's great for butterflies and other pollinators in the garden, just like many of these plants. Next is called blue sage salvia, and this is another great one where you can get any variety. Salvias do really well here in Missouri, probably one of the most abundant blooms. So right now I have a blue queen salvia, I've got a rose queen salvia, that both of those I was able to start from seed. I've got a caradonna salvia that's just incredible. It's coming to the end of its bloom stage, but it's really beautiful. And the cool thing about salvia is that often will give you 2 sets of blooms. They'll bloom late spring, early summer. You can chop them back and then they'll bloom again sometime late summer. So that's a really fun plant you can get creative with. There's all different color varieties and they all seem to perform well. Next is wild bergamot monarda. It's the cousin to bee balm. Esther Pye has this grown in her garden. It was what we called our mystery plant because for the longest time we didn't know what it was. We kept chopping it before it bloomed. So one year we decided to just let it go and not chop it down, and boy, when you do that, it gets to be 5-6 feet tall. And so we quickly discovered what it was. It's a wonderful plant that a lot of people use for tea. It's got incredible blooms on it. If you don't want that super tall wild variety, there are a few varieties of cultivated bee balm that do well here. Right now I have a purple variety called Purple Rooster. It's kind of being choked out by my mist flower, so I've got to try and rescue it. It's a variety that can handle our moisture. Sometimes monarda and bee balm plants have trouble with our moisture and get mildew on them. So the Purple Rooster variety is a good cultivated variety if you don't want to go with the super tall, crazy, wild variety. Next up for summer blooms is Blazing Star, liatris. The cultivated variety that I have, it's actually a white variety, does tend to flop here in Missouri, but the wild variety stands up nice and strong. It has more of a pink bloom on it. So that's one that you'd have to experiment with. With the white ones, sometimes what I'll do is I'll just trim them back early in the season, late spring-ish, and then they'll send up shorter shoots, so I'll still get some blooms, but they're not as floppy. And you know what? Sometimes they don't flop at all. I actually have some in our white garden right now that are standing up tall and strong and not flopping at all. So that one's kind of a question mark still, but liatris is fun because it's got a very unique bloom structure to it. It just adds a lot of character to the garden. And another great pollinator plant. Next up is called Goat's Beard. This is one that we just added to our garden recently, so we actually haven't seen the blooms yet. It's got some incredible blooms. I'm really looking forward to next year and hopeful that it's gonna bloom. Maybe it'll still bloom for us this year, we'll see. It's in a really tough location for us right now. It's in almost straight gravel and it gets pummeled by water in the springtime where it's at, but it's still surviving. It's one that I decided to get for the white garden just because of how unique the blooms are. So I'm really hoping it blooms, if not this year, next year. Next up is rose mallow. This is one that I didn't even realize was native, otherwise known as hardy hibiscus. And all the varieties that I've tried so far are doing fantastic in the garden. So it's one that you don't have to get the wild variety, you can get some of the other cultivated varieties. And let me tell you, there are a lot of varieties of this plant. We've got a bright pink colored one, we have a more burgundy wine colored one, we have a white one with red in the center that's more like the native variety, and then last year I was able to get a really fun new one with beautiful leaf foliage called Midnight Marvel. If you have not seen hardy hibiscus plants before, the flowers are enormous and they bloom for such a long time, all through the summer and into the fall, all the way to frost pretty much. So they're an incredible bushy plant that starts out from nothing to this nice bush. You do need to have a decent amount of space for them, but they can fit in a small garden just fine. The next plant I actually don't have the wild variety of. It's called rose verbena. The cultivated varieties are questionable. I've tried 2 different perennial verbenas that were cultivated and neither of them have survived very well. And then there's also a self-seeding variety called Verbena bonariensis. I think sometimes it can be perennial here in our zone, but it definitely self-seeds. And it's a beautiful plant. It gets nice and tall and has pretty purpley little puffballs on it. It pairs well with echinacea and some of the other summer wildflowers. But I have moved most of that out of the garden because it is quite aggressive as a self-seeding plant in the garden and it needs quite a bit of room. It gets pretty large. So I've moved a lot of that out to our swale, but I do have a few plants still in the garden. I just have to be careful in the spring to really thin them out. Alright, the last one for summer is wild hydrangea. This is one I don't have the wild variety of, and I'm still experimenting with the cultivated varieties. Right now I have an Annabelle, which I absolutely love, but it cannot stand up to our heavy rains. It flops over every time we have a heavy rain, so I'm having to stake it up, and actually some of the branches have broken off under the weight of the flowers in the rain. So that's one I'm hoping I can baby along because it's so beautiful. Alright, and last but not least is the fall bloomers, and this list is pretty short. Actually, I've already mentioned a couple of them here. Little blue stem carries on its color into the fall. Aromatic aster is another one that continues to bloom into the fall. Black-eyed Susans can sometimes go into the fall. And then mist flower, this is one I haven't mentioned. It's actually blooming right now for us. It doesn't usually bloom this early. It's usually more of a fall bloomer, but it's one that I just brought in from the wild and have been spreading it around the garden. And I will caution you, it is incredibly invasive. If you want to have the wild variety of mist flower in the garden, do beware that it may take over and you're going to have to manage it. That's one where you may actually want to go with a more cultivated variety in your garden that's not going to be so aggressive. And last but not least for fall is, I already mentioned Creeping Jenny. That one's pretty much spring, summer, and fall. It's just a foliage plant for the most part. It can be added to give character to any bed. So that's pretty much all of the native plants that we've got in our garden presently. There are a few that I would still like to get, but not very many. I'm pretty satisfied with the varieties that we have currently, and at this point I'm just kind of spreading them around to the new garden spaces as we develop them. And that's one of the really cool things about these native plants. Besides their hardiness, they just come back year after year, and you can often divide them, move their little seedlings around. They just keep on giving. So I think they're a really good investment. You can get one plant of a variety, and within a few years you will have many of those plants. There's actually 3 more plants that I want to share, and these were not in my book, so I don't know if they're technically natives, but they came from the wild and let them grow in the garden for medicinal purposes, so I'll share those with you right now. These are sweet violet leaves. The blooms have come and gone. They have purple blooms in the spring, and they're a really good plant because the leaves are super nutritious, so they can be dried for adding to teas, and they're good for decongestant as well. Not to mention that they make a beautiful ground cover here under all of our apple trees. This here is jewelweed, and you can tell it likes the shade a lot better. Thankfully it gets afternoon shade here, but the morning sun is pounding down on it right now, so it looks a little droopy. But this is a fantastic plant for if you get poison ivy. You can rub the juices and oils from the leaves and stems right on your poison ivy as early as you possibly can. And it's amazing at getting rid of poison ivy. We actually have a bunch of jewelweed growing down near our spring, and that's usually where we go to get it if anyone has poison ivy, but it just popped up in our garden last year and it came back this year, so I've left that little patch there just to make it easier, quick and easy for someone to grab it if they need it. And here's the last one. You probably all know what this is. It's plantain, and I try not to let it go to seed, so I'm gonna have to cut these seed pods off here. And I also try not to let it go too many places in the garden. I've got way too much of it right now that needs to be pulled because it is pretty aggressive. It will grow literally anywhere. But many of you probably know the benefit of plantain. It is absolutely the best thing, hands down, for stings. The other day I went to grab the handle to turn our hydrant on for the garden water here, and a bumblebee got stuck between my hand and the hydrant handle, and of course it stung me. Thankfully we've got the plantain right here in the garden, so I went to where I knew a plant was. I just took a little bit of the leaf off, made sure it looked clean, stuck it in my mouth, chewed it up, and put it on that bumblebee sting, and I tell you, within a minute the pain was subsiding. Within 5 minutes it was completely gone. So plantain really works. It is pretty yucky tasting, so you kind of have to spit out the bits after doing that, but that's the quickest way to get those medicinal properties coming out of the leaf, is to just chew it up really quick and put it right on the sting. It works super fast. Okay, I gotta mention one more plant here, guys, before we go. It's not technically a native, but it does grow wild here, and that's daylily. The daylily is edible, unlike regular lilies. So don't get confused. Regular lilies are not edible, but the flowers of daylilies are edible. And there are so many different colors and varieties. And so far, all 4 varieties that we have in our garden have done really, really well. We have the Catherine Woodsberry, which is a really pretty pale pinky peach color. We have a white one called Purely. And then we have 2 reblooming varieties. One's called Fragrant Returns, which is a pale yellow, and the other one's called Purple Dioro. Daylilies really like full sun, but they can handle a little bit of shade as well. And they're one that just keeps multiplying, so you can divide them out every year and spread them around. They're not aggressive spreaders, so pretty much they'll stay where you put them. They're just one of those standout flowers in the garden. When I look out into our garden and kind of scan over the whole thing, the daylilies are the ones that really pop out. So they're really fun flowers to have in the garden. Just had to mention them even though they're not native. Well, thanks so much for joining me in the garden today. I hope this video was helpful to some of you out there who are wanting to incorporate some more native plants in your gardens. If you live in Missouri or a similar climate and you have a native plant in your garden that works well that maybe I didn't mention in this video today, please share it in the comments below. And of course, if you have any questions about any of the plants I covered, leave them in the comments below. Before we go today, we have a couple thank yous to give.
Just want to say thank you to Ariana for the 2 windows for my future home. It's a really big gift. Thank you.
And thank you to whoever got us these forget-me-not seeds. It's one that I've never tried growing, at least I don't think I have, and that I've wanted to try. So I'm looking forward to trying these next year. It's a really pretty color blend of forget-me-nots. Thank you. Thank you, as always, to our patrons who make these videos possible. We appreciate you guys so much. Until next time, I pray blessings over you and yours. And whatever you do, do it with your whole heart. This is not a native, but I just had to share. Look at these hosta blooms. They're so beautiful. I never knew hostas could have such beautiful blooms, but they do. They seem to mostly be a foliage plant, because, I mean, look at that amazing foliage. But they have this bonus in the early summer. So fun.